Well, late last year, Malcolm Turnbull declined to reappoint Murice Newman as business advisor to the Prime Minister. The former Australian Stock Exchange and ABC chairman joins us now. Thanks for being here.
Nice to be here, Tony. Just let me correct you, though. The Prime Minister, Mr Turnbull, has given me the assurance that I'm still the chairman of the Business Advisory Council. He said that it would meet early in this new year, which it hasn't yet done. He would then decide as to whether he would continue with it. So
well, this
it may be a technical point.
I was going to say, this makes your criticism of him all the braver in some sense. Are you literally saying that Malcolm Turnbull's Liberal leadership could lead to the emergence of a new Conservative party?
Well, I think it's most likely that if the people who support the Liberal Party and the Liberal Party values find that essentially it's a Labor-like party, then they'll clearly be attracted to whatever alternatives might be presented to them.
But is that what you think it is, a Labor-like party, now that Malcolm Turnbull is leading it?
Yes, I think it is. I think that if you look at what few policy decisions have been taken, they are to give more money to renewable energy, to put more money into the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. There are all sorts of things which are for bigger government, not less, and there's essentially the sorts of policies that you would expect to see Labor bringing forward.
Now, obviously, you think that Tony Abbott had genuine Conservative values. Mr Turnbull hasn't rejected the Abbott legacy, though, according to his slogan of a couple of weeks ago, continuity with change. Have you ignored the continuity part of that argument?
Well, we have to see what continuity means. Certainly, if you look at the boats, that seems the boat arrivals, that seems to be a policy which he will retain. But I think we just have to wait and see when the election campaign comes along just exactly what Mr Turnbull is going to do.
Malcolm Turnbull had a remarkably successful business career. He's one of the wealthiest Australians. What is it about him that you regard as socialist?
Well, I think his position on most issues which are not what you would consider to be Conservative positions. When you look at, he's certainly left-leaning when it comes to government spending. There's no evidence that he wants to cut back on spending. He's constantly looking at ways to increase taxes. We looked at GST increase, which was subsequently discarded. Then we were looking at the state governments having to raise their own taxes, and that's now been discarded. They're policies which are not what I would see as being Conservative policies, where you are looking to move to a position where the budget is balanced, and balanced in a reasonably short space of time. What Mr Turnbull is banking on is growth. And I can tell you, as somebody who's spent a long time in business, that what you do is to cut your cloth according to your measure, and you don't simply risk everything on the potential growth.
This is what you wrote 2 weeks ago. Turnbull's business record suggests he's not a leader. He's more transactional. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think he's a lawyer and he's used to looking at transactions. That is, you look at one transaction at a time, one business proposition at a time, as opposed to being a leader, someone who is relationship oriented, which builds a team around him. And I think we've already seen in the course of the last 6 or 7 months that he's got an inner circle, an outer circle, and the people who obviously were disadvantaged as a consequence of the leadership change have been put out into the cold. We've seen a succession of Are
you surprised that Scott Morrison, for example, does not appear to be in the inner circle?
Well, given that he's the Treasurer, yes, it is surprising.
Now, you were Mr Abbott's business advisor, still are, evidently.
Well, Mr Turnbull's
business advisor. You retain strong links, obviously, to the business community. How is Prime Minister Turnbull regarded by the business sector? This is something business people are reluctant to talk about publicly. You're in a different position to them. What are business leaders saying about his Prime Ministership privately?
Well, I think that business people have a mixed view about Mr Turnbull. I think there's a view that he will lead them along and then suddenly let them go, and that their expectations are not fulfilled. And there have been a number of examples of that. And I think over a period of time, in his Whitlam Turnbull days and in his Goldman Sachs days, I think there are people who would point to the fact that their expectations, based on what he has said, haven't actually come to fruition.
So you're saying
he's changed his mind.
A lack of trust in the business community?
Well, I think people have to speak for themselves, but I think that it's fair to say that there are people who feel that they've been let down and that he hasn't fulfilled the expectations which he led them to hold.
Now, you mentioned earlier the debate on tax reform and including last week's attempt to introduce what he called the greatest reform to the Federation in generations. Now, I remember another Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, was given to making grandiose statements like this. Do you see any comparisons between these two?
Well, I think people who know both people well would agree that Mr Turnbull and Mr Rudd have similar personality characteristics. And I think you're referring to Mr Rudd having said that the climate change was the greatest moral imperative of our time, and we have Mr Turnbull talking about the tax reform for the states being the most important tax reforms since Federation. Both of those headland promises were sort of abandoned within a couple of weeks in the case of Mr Rudd, in the case of Mr Turnbull, I think about 48 hours.
And yet they're both the smartest guys in any room.
Well, I don't think anyone would ever doubt that either Mr Rudd or Mr Turnbull are extremely intelligent. I mean, there's no suggestion that these are very bright people.
But is it suggested that somehow being the smartest guy in the room doesn't necessarily make you a good leader?
It goes to judgment, and you need empathy and EQ as well as IQ to be a good leader.
Now, you've written that when the election comes, an army of baseball bats will be waiting for Liberal candidates. Are you predicting the same kind of scenario that Julia Gillard faced in 2010, having essentially, well, you can say stabbed in the back, but certainly overthrown a first-term Prime Minister?
Well, it's possible. It's a two-horse race. The polls have now gone from 50-50 to 49-51. From the coalition standpoint, and it would seem to me that once a 50% threshold has been breached, that could go even lower. I also think that if there's a double dissolution, this is Anthony Green's position, that this is a more dangerous situation for the coalition, particularly in the Senate, than if they were to go the full term. Also, it remains to be seen just how effective a campaigner Mr Turnbull is. Mr Abbott, we know, is a very effective campaigner, and this particular campaign, if it is to be a double dissolution election, will go for something like 12 weeks. So it's a long time, and so far he hasn't got off to a very good start.
Very briefly, who do you say would be holding those baseball bats?
I think these are people who have been hoping that there would be the policies which they voted for when they voted for Abbott that are now likely to be, in many cases, either overturned or shunned. We are in desperate need to get the budget back on track, and the evidence seems to be that we are going to let things slide and have to wait to the election, to the budget in 2017.
Murice Newman, we'll have to leave you. Thank you very much for coming in to talk to us tonight.
Pleasure.